There is a document in the archive of the German Foreign Office, dated November of 1884, that records the opening of a conference in Berlin, attended by representatives of 14 nations. The official history describes this gathering as a diplomatic effort to prevent conflict among European powers competing for influence in Africa, a rational, procedural response to the risk that competing territorial ambitions might produce a war among civilized states on the continent of Europe. That is the political account. It is not wrong, exactly. It simply leaves out what the financial record shows, that the men who convened the conference had already decided, in private correspondence that predates the opening session by more than a year, which river basins, which coastlines, and which mineral deposits would fall to which national capital. The conference did not resolve a scramble, it ratified one. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. And the instrument it used to do so was not a treaty in the conventional diplomatic sense. It was a pricing mechanism, a set of rules governing how a continent's land, labor, and natural resources could be legally transferred from African sovereigns to European corporate and state interests, at terms those sovereigns were never consulted about and, in most cases, never shown. The document produced by the conference is called the General Act of the Berlin Conference. It was signed on February 26, 1885. Most histories treat it as a piece of diplomatic architecture, a framework for managing European competition. The financial record treats it as something closer to a continental bill of sale. What that bill of sale transferred was not merely land. It transferred the right to determine the terms on which an entire continent's labor and natural resources would enter the global economy, for a period that none of the men who signed it had any interest in publicly defining as permanent, but that the institutional structures they created were designed to make as durable as possible. To understand what was being priced in Berlin, it is necessary to understand what Africa represented to European capital in the decade before the conference convened. By 1880, the continent's interior remained largely beyond European administrative reach, but its coastlines and major river systems had been threaded through with European commercial relationships for generations. Trading firms operating from Liverpool, Marseille, Hamburg, and Antwerp moved palm oil, rubber, ivory, groundnuts, and beeswax through coastal factor houses into European commodity markets. The profits on these trades were real and growing, but the structure of the trade itself was commercially unstable in a way that the men directing these firms understood very precisely. African merchants and rulers controlled the interior supply chains. They determined which goods moved to the coast and at what price. They chose their commercial partners. They renegotiated terms when the balance of advantage shifted. A firm that had held a dominant position on the Niger Delta in one decade might find itself competing on unfavorable terms with a French rival in the next, because the African intermediaries who moved palm oil down the river had no particular loyalty to any European flag. What European capital wanted, and what the Berlin Conference was ultimately designed to deliver, was not merely expanded access to African commodities. It was the permanent elimination of African economic agency over the terms of that access, the conversion of a trading relationship in which Africans set prices into an extraction relationship in which Europeans did. The institution that did the most to shape this outcome was not a government ministry. It was a private commercial entity called the International Association of the Congo, founded in 1876 and controlled entirely by King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold's position in European politics was unusual. He was a constitutional monarch whose government had no colonial tradition and no appetite for one. Belgium's parliament and its foreign ministry had no interest in the expense and complexity of overseas empire. Leopold did not share this restraint. He had been studying colonial economics for years, had toured Dutch colonial operations in Southeast Asia, and had concluded that the combination of African rubber and ivory with European capital and coercive labor systems could generate returns that no conventional investment opportunity could match. What he needed was territory, and he needed a legal framework within which to hold it. His method for acquiring both was architecturally elegant. He hired Henry Morton Stanley, whose crossing of the Congo Basin in 1877 had produced detailed accounts of the river system's navigable extent, and whose reputation as an explorer was then at its peak in European public consciousness, to return to the region and sign treaties with African chiefs along the river and its tributaries. The treaties were written in French and English. They were brief. The chiefs who marked them, in exchange for cloth, liquor, and in some cases nothing at all, were ceding, according to the text, all sovereign rights over their territories in perpetuity to Leopold's association. In a number of cases documented by missionaries who were present, the chiefs understood the marks they made as agreements of friendship and trade, not as transfers of territorial sovereignty. The concept of individual private property and land, and the legal mechanism of sovereignty transfer through written instrument, had no equivalent in the governance systems of the communities whose marks were being collected. By the time the Berlin Conference opened in November of 1884, Leopold's association held paper claim to a territory in the Congo basin larger than the entirety of Western Europe. His task at Berlin, pursued through intermediaries and through a sustained diplomatic campaign in the capitals of Europe and in Washington, was to get the assembled powers to recognize those claims as legally valid under international law. He succeeded. The General Act recognized the Congo Free State, Leopold's personal holding, as a legitimate sovereign entity with him at its head. No other attendee held their territory in this form, as private property rather than national colony. The conference had created a category of sovereignty specifically to accommodate Leopold's commercial structure, and the financial consequence of that recognition was immediate and specific. Leopold now controlled the legal collection of what the Act called the products of the soil, across an area containing some of the richest rubber forests then known to exist anywhere on the planet. The rubber that moved through Leopold's Congo Free State between 1890 and 1908 reached European markets through Antwerp's commodity exchange at prices set by European merchants. The African men who collected it were not paid for their labor. They worked under a quota system administered by Leopold's Force Publique, the armed militia that enforced extraction across the territory. The General Act had defined the Congo Basin as a free trade zone open to the commerce of all signatory nations. Leopold's operational interpretation of this clause was that trade was free for European merchants dealing in the outputs of extraction, while the inputs, land, labor, and resource rights, were his alone to dispose of. The gap between those two provisions was where the revenue was produced. The scale of what Leopold's personal accounts recorded from the Congo in the decade between 1895 and 1905 was reconstructed by historian Adam Hochschild from Belgian Royal Archive materials and published in his 1998 study. Net receipts exceeded 100 million Belgian francs across that period. The labor cost of the extraction that produced this figure was, by design, zero. The architecture that made it possible, the legal instrument of the General Act, the corporate structure of the Congo Free State, and the enforcement mechanism of the Force Publique had been assembled through a conference that the diplomatic record describes as a gathering for the peaceful management of European rivalry in Africa. The Berlin Conference did not invent the colonial project in Africa. What it did was systematize it across the continent and provide it with a common legal language. Before Berlin, European territorial claims in Africa were a patchwork of coastal enclaves, treaty rights, protectorate relationships, and trading concessions that had accumulated without a common framework. Disputes between European powers over overlapping claims had no formal resolution mechanism. The General Act created one, and in doing so it created a set of institutional incentives that accelerated the territorial partition of the continent more effectively than any deliberate policy could have. The mechanism was the effective occupation clause. The Act established that a European power could claim sovereignty over African territory only if it could demonstrate actual administrative and commercial presence there, courts, tax collection, governance structures, control of trade. This sounds, on its surface, like a restraint on expansionism. In practice, it operated as a race condition. Every European foreign ministry that read the clause understood immediately that if it did not establish administrative presence in territories where its commercial interests were operating, a rival would do so first, and the Berlin framework would legitimize that rival's claim. The effective occupation clause did not slow the partition. It turned it into a competitive sprint. The British response to this structural incentive was the most systematically documented. The correspondence between the Foreign Office and the Board of Trade in the months immediately following the conference's conclusion shows a careful inventory of every coastline, river system, and interior region where British commercial operations were active without formal territorial claim. The conclusion of this review was the rapid chartering of a series of commercial entities granted sovereign powers over defined territories, charged with establishing the administrative presence the Berlin framework required while operating as private profit-making ventures accountable to their shareholders. The Royal Niger Company, chartered in 1886, is the most precisely documented of these instruments. Its governor, George Taubman Goldie, had spent the preceding decade consolidating British trading interests on the Niger by buying out French competitors at prices that left them unable to continue operating, and by signing treaties with riverside chiefs using the same method Stanley had employed in the Congo. The Berlin Framework gave those treaties standing under European international law. The company's charter gave it the power to collect customs duties, to set trading terms, and to exclude competitors from the rivers it controlled. Its financial structure gave British investors a direct claim on the revenue streams that followed. The arithmetic of the Royal Niger Company's operations was published annually in its accounts. The company collected customs duties on all trade moving through the Niger Delta. It set the prices at which African producers could sell palm oil and groundnuts to its trading posts. It prohibited African traders from dealing directly with other European merchants. The treaties it had signed with local rulers, now legitimized by the Berlin Framework, gave it legal standing to enforce these prohibitions. What this produced, in commercial terms, was a monopsony. African producers had one buyer, and that buyer set the price. The General Act had described the commercial arrangement it was creating as free trade. The Royal Niger Company's balance sheets described it as profit. The French drew identical conclusions from Berlin and moved with comparable urgency. The treaties that French commercial agents signed across West Africa in the years between 1885 and 1895 followed a template refined through experience and coordinated through the colonial ministry in Paris. A brief document, signed by an African chief or council, ceding administrative rights to a French protectorate authority in exchange for a payment set unilaterally by the French party to the transaction, was submitted to the Foreign Ministry as evidence of effective occupation. The territory appeared on French colonial maps. The chiefs who had signed, in many cases, continued to govern their communities under the impression that they had entered a trading arrangement, until a French administrative officer arrived to collect the head tax that the protectorate system imposed. The monetary architecture that France built across West Africa after Berlin completed the commercial structure the treaties had established. The Banque de l'Afrique Occidentale, founded in 1889, with a concession from the French colonial ministry, held the monopoly on currency issue across French West African territories. The currency it issued was backed by French francs held in Paris. African producers who sold goods to French trading houses received this currency. They could use it to pay the taxes that colonial administration collected, which were denominated in the same currency and calibrated to compel participation in the export economy. They could not convert it or use it outside the French commercial circuit without transacting at exchange rates the bank set. The monetary system of French West Africa was not designed to serve local economic exchange. It was designed to keep the proceeds of African commodity production inside the French commercial and financial system. The German case is less examined in English-language accounts, but the financial structure it produced was recognizably identical. The German colonial society, founded in 1882, was closely connected to the banking house of Bleichroeder, which served as Bismarck's personal financial manager and held a central position in the financing of the German imperial state. Gerson von Bleichroeder's correspondence with Bismarck in the early 1880s, portions of which were published in Fritz Stern's 1977 biography, presents the case for colonial acquisition with the directness of a banking memorandum. The territories under discussion contain resources whose extraction would yield returns comparable to those being realized by British and French commercial interests. The infrastructure investment required to access those resources would generate demand for German capital goods and German financial services. The conference that Bismarck convened in Berlin was not, in this commercial reading, primarily a diplomatic exercise. It was the instrument through which German capital acquired the legal framework it needed to compete in the African resource market on equal terms with British and French firms that had established earlier positions. The General Act that emerged from 3 months of negotiation in Berlin produced across all of these national commercial structures what amounts to a continental pricing system. The prices at which African labor was purchased, African land was transferred, and African resources were extracted were set, in each case, by the European party to the transaction, operating within a legal framework that European governments had designed and that African rulers and producers had no role in creating. The Act defined the rules of property, the instruments of enforcement, and the terms of trade. The continent's economic output for the 6 decades that followed was priced according to those rules. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The first sustained public examination of what those prices had actually produced came not from a European government, but from the inquiry that the British Parliament conducted into the Congo Free State between 1903 and 1906. Its impetus was Edmund Morel, a shipping clerk employed by the Elder Dempster Line in Antwerp, who had observed, while processing cargo manifests, that the vessels returning from the Congo carried rubber and ivory, while those departing carried weapons and ammunition. No trade goods, no payment. The arithmetic had one explanation. the labor producing the rubber was not compensated. Morel published this analysis in a series of articles and pamphlets, whose circulation reached into the British Parliament and the American press. Roger Casement, the British consul in the Congo, submitted a report to the Foreign Office in 1904 that documented in systematic detail the administrative machinery through which the rubber quota operated. The Foreign Office initially attempted to restrict its circulation before releasing a censored version under parliamentary pressure. The full Casement report was not made publicly available until decades later. What it recorded was specific and extensive: the hostage-taking of women and children to compel male labor output, the severing of hands as proof by force publique militias that their ammunition had been used on human targets rather than fired into the forest, and the population decline across rubber-producing districts that Casement estimated conservatively at several million people across the period of Leopold's personal administration. The financial record behind this testimony was not examined in the parliamentary proceedings. What the inquiry addressed was the conduct of Leopold's administration. What it did not address was the relationship between the rubber price the Congo Free State was receiving on the Antwerp market, the structure of costs that produced that price, and the returns that Leopold's personal accounts were accumulating. The inquiry produced a political outcome. Leopold was compelled to transfer the Congo to the Belgian state in 1908, under sustained international pressure that the Morel campaign and the parliamentary process had made impossible to deflect. The territory was transferred. The revenue structure that had generated Leopold's returns was not dismantled. Belgian colonial administration replaced his private apparatus, but the fundamental arrangement compelled or coerced African labor-producing commodities for European markets at prices set by European trading houses persisted through Belgian colonial rule until Congolese independence in 1960. The rubber concession system gave way to the mining concessions that the copper deposits of Katanga made financially significant. The Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, whose shareholders were Belgian, British, and American, operated Katanga's copper mines under concessions that Belgian colonial administration granted and enforced. The labor force that worked those mines was drawn from a population that had no legal standing to negotiate the terms of its own employment under the colonial framework the Berlin General Act had legitimized. The thread between the 1885 document and the 1950s mining operations is not figurative. It runs through the specific legal instruments, the Charter of the Congo Free State, the Belgian colonial legislation that succeeded it, and the mining concession agreements that transferred resource rights from the Congolese state to European and American capital, each of which derived its validity from the framework the Berlin Conference had established. The admission that the General Act functioned as a revenue instrument rather than a diplomatic settlement was made, over time and in fragments, by the accumulated testimony of the parliamentary inquiry, by the memoir literature of colonial administrators, who wrote after retirement with a frankness their official reports had not permitted, and by the economic historians who reconstructed the trade accounts of the colonial period in the decades following African independence. The economist Morton Jervin, examining colonial-era trade data across sub-Saharan Africa, documented that the terms of trade between African commodity exporters and European manufactured goods importers deteriorated consistently across the colonial period. African producers received less and less in exchange for each unit of exported output as the volume of that output increased. The structure of the trade, in other words, transferred an increasing share of the gains from African commodity production to European markets as Africa's productive capacity grew. The aggregate transfer of wealth that this terms of trade deterioration implies, across 6 decades of colonial extraction from a continent of several hundred million people, has not been quantified with the precision that a complete audit would require. The records that would enable such an audit are distributed across the national archives of former colonial powers, the private archives of chartered companies and colonial banks, and the administrative records of colonial governments, many of which were selectively destroyed or transferred to restricted storage in the period preceding independence. What the available evidence establishes clearly enough is the direction wealth produced by African labor and African natural resources moved, through the institutional mechanisms the Berlin framework legitimized, into European capital markets, European industrial enterprises, and European state revenues across the entire colonial period. The specific financial institutions through which this movement was organized have not disappeared. They have changed names, been acquired, merged, and restructured across the decades since decolonization, but their institutional lineage runs directly back to the colonial period. Barclays Bank, which in 1925 acquired the Colonial Bank that had operated across British West Africa since 1836, held the deposit accounts and managed the foreign exchange operations of British colonial governments across the continent for decades. The Société Générale de Banque, which traced its origins to the Banque de Belgique and held a dominant position in Belgian Congo's financial system, continued to operate in the Democratic Republic of Congo after independence under renegotiated concession arrangements. The Standard Bank of South Africa, which became Standard Chartered through its merger with Chartered Bank in 1969, had financed the diamond and gold mining operations of Southern Africa since the 1880s, under concessions that the Berlin Framework and its derivatives had made possible. These are not secret institutions. Their histories are publicly documented. What is less consistently examined is the relationship between their colonial-era balance sheets and the capital accumulation that made their contemporary scale possible. The parliamentary and legal record that the Berlin Conference left behind is accessible. The General Act is published. The charter documents of the Royal Niger Company, the Imperial British East Africa Company, the German East Africa Company, and the comparable instruments of Belgian, French, Portuguese, and Italian colonial administration are in national archives. The private correspondence of the banking houses that funded colonial enterprise and lobbied for the legal frameworks that protected their investments is partially available in family and institutional archives. What these documents show, taken together, is not a story of incidental exploitation that accompanied a civilizing mission whose primary purpose was political stability. They show a systematic institutional design for the extraction of African economic value at terms set entirely by European commercial and state interests, legitimized by a legal framework created in a single room in Berlin over 3 months in the winter of 1884, and maintained through the successive institutional forms of colonial administration, chartered company governance, and post-independence monetary and trade arrangements for more than a century afterward. The conference that produced this framework has been described as a moment of European order-making. The financial record describes it as something the ledger has never struggled to name. The General Act of the Berlin Conference has never been formally repealed. It was superseded in legal terms by subsequent treaties, by the dissolution of the colonial administrations it authorized, and by the emergence of African states whose sovereignty the international system now recognizes under an entirely different legal framework. The document itself remains in the German Federal Archive, its text still legible, its provisions still coherent as a statement of the institutional logic that governed Africa's relationship to European capital for 6 decades. The continent it priced is still negotiating the consequences of those terms. The debt obligations of African governments whose fiscal capacity was shaped by colonial extraction remain among the most constraining features of contemporary African development finance. The trade structures that continue to move African raw commodities to European and Asian processing facilities at prices set by commodity markets whose architecture the colonial period established have not been fundamentally altered by the decades since independence. The franc zone monetary arrangements that several former French colonies maintain still locate their foreign exchange reserves in Paris and still peg their currencies to a rate set by the French treasury. The conference lasted 3 months. The pricing mechanism it created has lasted considerably longer than anyone in that room in Berlin, in the autumn of 1884, was prepared to say out loud. What the standard account of the Berlin Conference consistently omits is the degree to which the conference's institutional outcomes were pre-negotiated in private commercial correspondence before a single delegate took his seat in Bismarck's chancellery. The geographic boundaries that were drawn across the African continent in the years immediately following Berlin did not emerge from the deliberations of the conference itself. They emerged from a set of bilateral deals between European governments that had been quietly advancing since the late 1870s, coordinated through the banking houses and trading company boards that held the largest commercial stakes in the outcome, and subsequently ratified by the conference's general framework. The conference was the public face of an arrangement that had been made in private. The role of private capital in structuring this arrangement is most precisely visible in the case of the Imperial British East Africa Company, chartered in 1888. 3 years after the General Act was signed. The company was granted administrative sovereignty over a territory encompassing what is now Kenya and Uganda, with powers of taxation, treaty-making, and law enforcement. Its capital was raised on the London Stock Exchange through a prospectus that described the territory's commercial potential in terms any investor in colonial ventures would have recognized: fertile agricultural land, navigable river systems, ivory-bearing elephant populations, and most significantly, the terminus of a potential railway connection to the Great Lakes region, whose construction would open the interior to commercial exploitation. The prospectus was, in financial terms, an asset description. The territory it described had people living in it whose relationship to the land the prospectus did not address, because the legal framework the Berlin General Act had established made that relationship commercially irrelevant. Under the effective occupation doctrine, African customary land tenure had no standing against a European chartered company that could demonstrate administrative presence. The railway that the prospectus anticipated was eventually built by the British government rather than the company, whose capital proved insufficient for the scale of the undertaking. The Uganda Railway, constructed between 1896 and 1901, at a cost to the British Treasury of £5,200,000, ran from the port of Mombasa to Lake Victoria. Its commercial logic was stated explicitly in the parliamentary debates over its funding. The railway was necessary to open the interior to settlement and commodity production that would generate the export volumes required to make the territory economically self-sustaining. The labor to build it was imported from India because the British colonial administration had determined that the local African population was insufficiently accustomed to wage labor for large-scale construction work, a determination that had less to do with the actual availability of African labor than with the wage rates that Indian indentured workers would accept. The railway's construction costs were subsequently charged to the revenues of the East Africa Protectorate, meaning that African taxpayers in the territory were made to service the debt incurred to build an infrastructure whose primary purpose was facilitating the extraction of African resources and the settlement of European farmers on African land. This transfer of infrastructure costs onto colonized populations while the commercial benefits flowed to European investors and settlers was not accidental. It was the standard financial architecture of colonial development across the African territories the Berlin Framework had opened to partition. The chartered companies that held initial administrative sovereignty were typically undercapitalized for the infrastructure investment that effective occupation required, and they transferred administrative responsibility to their respective national governments when the cost of governance exceeded the revenue that early extraction could support. The national governments then financed the necessary infrastructure through loans raised in European capital markets, with the servicing of those loans charged to colonial revenues, meaning, ultimately, to the taxes collected from African populations. The financial structure that this produced was one in which the capital risk of colonial enterprise was progressively socialized onto colonized populations, while the returns on successful extraction accrued to European shareholders, bondholders, and metropolitan governments. The Berlin Conference's General Act did not specify this financial architecture. It did not need to. The legal framework it created, property rights vested in European corporations and states, African customary tenure unrecognized under international law, resource extraction rights tradable as commercial assets, made this architecture the natural outcome of the commercial incentives it established. The men who drafted the General Act understood this. The financial correspondence of the period, in the archives of the major colonial trading houses and the German and British colonial ministries, shows a consistent awareness that the legal framework being created would determine the distribution of economic returns from African resources for an extended period. The discussion of that distribution was precise. The parties whose interests were being served did not intend the outcome to be ambiguous. The question that the financial record poses, and that the political account of the Berlin Conference does not answer, is the one that runs beneath all the institutional detail. What would African economic development have produced had the Berlin Framework not been imposed? The question cannot be answered definitively, because history does not run controlled experiments. What can be said, on the basis of the economic record that exists, is that the African states and commercial networks that were operating before the partition were not economically stagnant. The groundnut trade of Senegambia, the palm oil trade of the Niger Delta, the textile production of the Yoruba cities, the gold trade of the Ashanti Kingdom, these were functioning commercial economies with established trade networks, credit systems, and price-setting mechanisms that the Berlin Framework was specifically designed to subordinate to European commercial control. The argument that the partition brought commercial modernity to a commercially undeveloped continent was not supported by the evidence available to the men who made it. It was a rhetorical instrument for the legitimization of an institutional arrangement whose actual purpose the financial record makes considerably clearer. The legacy of the General Act is not a historical abstraction. It is present in the structure of African sovereign debt, in the composition of African export baskets, in the location of African foreign exchange reserves, and in the governance frameworks of the international commodity markets through which African raw materials continue to flow to processing facilities outside the continent. The conference that convened in Berlin in 1884 did not merely divide a map. It established the institutional terms on which an entire continent's economic relationship to the rest of the world would be organized, and it did so without the participation of the continent's inhabitants, in the interest of a set of capital holders whose names appear in the archives of European banking houses and colonial company boards, rather than in the diplomatic record that the standard historical account preserves. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.